You notice the topic for today. Frankly, there's a reason I put this lecture last. It's the hardest lecture for me to give. This is partly because I've spent my entire professional life thinking about and working towards this subject. And the hardest part of doing these lectures is filtering down what you know so that it can fit in an hour, really 50 minutes, because I like to leave some time for questions. And in this particular case, it's very difficult for me to do this. I actually wrote my graduate school essay on this subject. So in any case, as I say, it's difficult. And this morning, I found a way to help me through this dilemma. And it's a kind of scary way to wend my way through this subject matter. It's the summarization from AI. It's scary. AI can be so good at some of this stuff. And I'm now going to read for you the summarization of these two artists from AI, and it'll help you understand the difference between the word religion and the word faith. The reason I have them both up there, you probably think of them as synonymous, but in reference to our lecture today, they are not synonymous at all. They refer to two different things. And so I'm going to read the summarization that AI gives us. First of all, with Caravaggio. Caravaggio's religion is grounded in the physical world. He brought the heavens down to the dirt of the Roman streets. And in a few moments, you'll be able to see that. Now to go to Rouault, our second artist. Rouault's religion is grounded in emotional interiority. In other words, it's inward. It's not external, it's inward. A devout Catholic, he saw the world through the lens of a monk living in the modern age. So we're going to start talking about these two artists and keep that metaphor in mind. Exterior, physical, visible, actual world, Caravaggio. Interior, mystical, emotional, Rouault. Now, can we talk a little bit about Caravaggio? It's extremely hard to summarize Caravaggio's short life. He died in his 30s. He is probably one of the most gifted artists that ever lived in the technical sense of the word. But he is also one of the most troubling personalities. It's extremely difficult to talk about his life. In the material that I got in preparation for this lecture, there's a map of Italy that shows Caravaggio's travels, and it looks like the United Airlines flight pattern. They're back and forth all over Italy, and the reason he's traveling all over Italy, everywhere he goes, he gets into trouble. He gets in brawls in bars. He killed at least one person, maybe two. It's questionable how he died. He might have died as a result of a brawl. He might have died from a infection, but it was en route from one of his runnings away from his bad behavior. So he just lives this wild life. Another part of him that's very difficult to deal with and modern people to understand is, as at least as we understand this from the historical records, he was bisexual. We know he hung around a lot with prostitutes, and in fact, we're going to see several of them in the paintings we're going to be looking at. But we also know he had a inclination towards intimate male companionship. I'm using euphemisms for homosexuality. So any case, complicated guy. When I think about Caravaggio, I think about one of Jesus' parables. I think most of us who are people of faith need to constantly keep that parable in mind. It's the parable of the wheat and the tares. And the parable is those of us who are mortal need to be careful in our attempts to purify our faith and our faith community, because we are not able to fully judge all the circumstances that make a person who they are. And we may think we're purifying the wheat, and we may in fact be eliminating wheat by our censorship in our faith communities. It's by the external facts of his life, you could in fact say this is not a person of faith. But by the evidence of the artwork, you could say this is a person of very deep faith. And we'll let God decide that one. Let's look at the first painting here. Supper at Emmaus, probably many of you are familiar with the gospel story. After the crucifixion, two disciples who are walking along the road to Emmaus, a third person joins them. They stop at a hostel or hotel, and this third person, when he breaks the bread at their mealtime, is revealed to them as the crucified Christ, the person who they've been talking about on this road. What Caravaggio does is take that story and put us right inside of that story, right at the moment of miracle. Now, the thing to notice about this painting, and by the way, most of his paintings are quite large. We generally, when we have the measurements, include them. And typically in his paintings, when you see figures, they're represented life-size. And that's another way of bringing you into the scene and making you feel like you're right there. You'll notice you get a visible reaction on the two figures seated with the Christ. The Christ is, of course, the figure in the middle of the painting. And you notice the two figures on either side of him. One of them apparently is a fisherman. Of course, Jesus, as we know, hung around with a lot of fishermen. He's got this seashell on this leather vest that he's wearing. And you'll notice the people as he represents them. Almost never do you see handsome, ideal type people in Caravaggio paintings. They're down-to-earth, real people. These are just ordinary laborers. This other figure who is reacting as visibly as that figure is, you notice he sticks his arms out in a kind of astonishment mode, the fisherman. This other figure, we don't know what he does, but we know whatever it is wore a hole in the elbow of his jacket. He's just an ordinary guy. And he's got his arms on his chair. He looks like he's ready to stand up. He's so astonished by what's going on. So Caravaggio puts you right in the middle of that. He loves to make these realistic still life renditions, as we see on the table with all the food. So you get these dramatic reactions, but then look at the figure that is standing. This is presumably the innkeeper. He's just looking down. He's not reacting in any dramatic way. He maybe doesn't even get it. You know, this is a miracle for the eyes of faith. There is a kind of bent position to his head. Maybe he has a hint of something here. He looks serious, but he clearly doesn't react in the dramatic physical way we see the other two disciples. Now, Caravaggio was a dramatic painter and a controversial painter all the time, even technically, because most painters at this time drew in charcoal on the canvas. And then they started to follow those outlines. They might have modified it. The reason it was charcoal, you could wipe it away and change it. But it gave you guidelines. Caravaggio gets models from the streets of Rome or wherever he is, brings them in the studio, and doesn't draw anything, starts painting directly on the canvas. He was probably one of the most gifted, technically gifted artists that the art world has ever seen. The other thing to be aware of in this particular painting, and you'll see it as characteristic of his work, you notice how dark the scene is. And yet we get this bright light in the center of the painting that almost seems to emanate from the Christ. And so you get this dramatic play between dark and light. Sometimes the paintings are so dark you can't even quite figure out what's going on. And that's kind of a metaphor for revelation, that somehow this is revealed to us if we have faith, the light of faith. Can we see the next one? The guy is, you know, just by the nature of his life, as I've described it to you, he paints religious paintings, and yet he's kind of irreverent guy. A horse's rear end occupies 3/4 of the painting of the Conversion of St. Paul. It's hardly what we would think of as a reverential approach to that subject. Again, look at the scale of the painting. Figures are just about life size. We see Paul on the ground in some sort of a trance. His arms are open. The light is falling on him, again, a kind of light of revelation. The servant appears to be holding the horse, and the servant is barely lit. We can hardly recognize him. And in fact, it's hard to figure out the servant's full anatomy. I can never figure out how his toe ended up there. I have a hard time connecting that toe to that head up there. In any case, the servant doesn't get it. He's just sort of background material. You see how the lighting becomes the key theatrical event. By the way, Caravaggio is the artist most credited with creating the Baroque style. Now remember, Caravaggio's Italian. There's another Italian form happening at the same time that Caravaggio is painting in the 1600s. That art form is opera. And any of you who have ever seen opera know it's an art form that generally does not deal with subtlety. It's a high drama art form. It's loud, it's flamboyant. It's one of the most complex art forms there is. I used to be a dean of a school of music. I used to dread the spring of the year because every spring we did an opera. And you've got the stage director and the set designer. You've got the orchestra leader. You've got the vocal coach, and then you've got the singers. Now, every one of them had their own idea how this opera should be staged. And I'm the dean of the School of Music. I've got to make up my mind who does what and who gets what. And so spring was never very much fun. In fact, I ended up firing one opera director and getting into major trouble with his wife, who was also a member of the School of Music. But fortunately, the president agreed with my judgment, so he stayed fired. Anyway, this is Baroque art. It's always dramatic. And you'll notice the arms upraised, sort of being receptive to the light, create a diagonal line. A diagonal line is a line of action. And Baroque art is full of diagonal lines. Now, can we see the next one, please? Talking about diagonals, here's a painting with diagonals everywhere. I don't know if you all know the story of Peter. It's not in the scriptures, but it seems to be somewhat historically documented. Peter was, of course, crucified like Christ, because he was one of the early martyrs of the faith, but he said, I'm not worthy to be crucified like my master. So supposedly he was crucified upside down, which is, if you know anything about the physical dynamics of crucifixion, in fact, probably amounted to much, much more suffering than, in fact, Christ had by being crucified upright. Anyway, this is that image. I showed some of you a while ago one of Rubens' paintings about a crucifixion. There are 8 or 9 figures lifting the cross in the Rubens painting. I said, this is crazy. This is the nuttiest way to lift a cross. This Caravaggio's a guy who knows how to do the scene in a realistic way. Now you've got 3 guys, one of them with a rope pulling the back end of the cross, other one under the cross, sort of resting it on his back. And of course, Caravaggio knew all these people. These were street people. He brings them all in the studio. They actually pose like this for him, and he paints directly from these models. And of course, the studio was not lit like this, so in many ways, Caravaggio's paintings seem extraordinarily realistic, but if you know anything about painting, you know how invented they really are. And first of all, he has to figure out all these poses and how this is going to work on the canvas. And then, of course, he has to think through colors and lighting and so on, none of which he can exactly replicate in the studio. So he's extremely realistic and at the same time imaginative. He's making up as he goes along to make it seem real, to put us right in the middle of this event. Can we see the next one, please? There's a fancy name for this darkened kind of approach that's a part of Caravaggio's painting. It's called tenebrism. And this is the calling of St. Matthew. And he places the whole calling, which we think of as a sort of sacred event, in the middle of a bar. This is Matthew hanging around his bar buddies. And the question I ask myself, and I leave with you, is which one is Matthew? The fingers pointing become a part of what this painting is about. I've read some commentaries saying this figure here, the last set of pointing figures we see, is Matthew. But it doesn't look to me like he's pointing to himself. I think he's pointing to this guy here. Now, Matthew, remember, is a tax collector. Here you get money on the tabletop. Matthew looks like he's counting money. Maybe he's hungover. Remember, they're in a bar. Any case, I think that's St. Matthew, but it's never been completely clear who is St. Matthew here. But you see how he takes what is supposed to be a sacred event and brings it totally into the secular real world, the kind of world that he lived in and hung out in. And of course, all the costumes are Baroque, Renaissance type costumes. He's not bringing it into the world of Palestine in that regard. He's making us live that event by being in this painting. It's as physical just about as art can get. Can we see the next one? He got into trouble for this one. You know, look at the scale of this. The thing is 12 feet high, 8 feet across. This obviously is not the kind of painting he did for himself. It was part of a church commission, probably meant to be in the altar area of a church. Now, any of you with a Catholic heritage know that the official teaching of the church is that Mary was assumed. By assumed, we mean someone who's elevated to heaven without dying in the normal way, being carried up into heaven. The prophet Elijah also gets into that category in the Old Testament. Anyway, that's the whole idea of the assumption. And that's the official doctrine of the Catholic Church. How he got away with this painting, by the way, the figure that's Mary laying prostrate there in the middle of the painting is a very well-known prostitute from Rome. Everyone knew who she was, and she ends up being the Virgin in this painting. And you see all these figures around her reacting to her failing. One of the more controversial parts of the painting is her feet sticking out from the gown. Somehow that's, in that cultural setting, regarded as being too intimate, especially for a holy figure like Mary. The other part of it that I comment about is he puts these heavy draperies over the scene. Now, it's not at all clear what the heck those draperies are about, but they appear to enclose that space, enclose that painting, and seem to contradict the whole idea of her flying upward to heaven, because in fact the draperies are in the way. But you've got to admit, it's a painting, especially if you imagine the scale of it. You know, it's almost twice as big in scale as the image you see on the screen. You've got to concede that it gets your attention. It brings you into that tragedy. Now, can we see the next one? This is towards the end of his life. Again, we don't know exactly how he died, but apparently he becomes more cautious, more reflective towards the end of his life. And so here we see a scene of Saint Jerome writing, and of course writing is a cautious, reflective, quiet activity. You see the skull off to the side, kind of a symbol of mortality. And Jerome is translating the scriptures. He's one of the major Catholic translators. You notice, if you look carefully, and you really do have to look carefully, it's one of the few halos you see in a Caravaggio painting. Look carefully above St. Jerome's head. You just get a brief hint of the edge of a clear disc shape up there. When I look at it, being a sculptor who works with materials, I think of a hunk of plexiglass plastic up there. But in any case, it is a hint of a halo. And you'll notice the composition has far fewer diagonals in it now. It's got this more or less horizontal plane that's the main focus of the composition, associated with the biblical witness, his arm, and of course the horizontality of the tabletop. And a kind of odd parallel between the baldness of Saint Jerome and the baldness of the skull itself. And is he playing with our understanding by creating that kind of parallel? It's hard to say. Now, I think that's our last Caravaggio. And now for something completely different. We're going to go away from the outside and going to move into the interior. We're going to look at the work of Georges Rouault, a French painter. I have to admit, one of my personal heroes, because he represents for me the issue of how do you become a Christian artist in a secular world? You'll notice Caravaggio's work is big. All the figures are life size. It's meant for public space. Again, remember, we're talking about the exterior when we talk about Caravaggio. With Rouault, we'll notice the paintings are all interior size, relatively small paintings. A lot of his paintings are only 10 or 12 inches across. But most of the paintings I'll show you here are some of his more famous works, and they're normally conventional wall-size paintings. He's part of the modern movement of Expressionism. His work is probably in some ways inspired by another artist who had deep religious faith, Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh is often thought to be the father of Expressionism. Expressionism is a form of painting in which colors are very vivid and emotion is the critical sort of what the painting is about, strong feeling. Appearances get modified for the sake of bright color and compositional purposes. And you'll find that with Rouault. He actually, the strangest thing, as I've said to you before, we create these lectures from the computer websites. The website for Caravaggio was over 20 pages long. The website for Rouault was a page and a half. Fortunately, I have a book about Rouault at home. As I say, he's one of my heroes. And he's dealing with the fact of how do you present faith in a context where there is no cultural context for faith. You know, Caravaggio is working in a Christian culture. Everybody knows these symbols. Everyone knows these stories. This is just part of your life in 1600 Italian, on the Italian peninsula. All of a sudden, when you get to 21st century, you're in a culture where not everyone knows what these things mean. And they aren't commonly assumed. And the artist has to almost start to create their own symbols. Not symbols they inherit from the culture, but symbols they think represent the depth of their own faith and commitment. That's been my history as an artist, and that certainly was Rouault's history as an artist. He came from a very, very poor family. He was born in a basement. He lived, in fact, a very normal life. He married at the normal time, ended up having 4 kids. But he was a very bright guy. Even though he came from a poor family, he found a way to get a really high quality art education. The artists of his own age, one of the most notable being Henri Matisse, thought of him as one of the best of the students in the Parisian art environment. But like any expressionist, the work itself you're going to be looking at is intensely emotional. But because it's that way, it's not realistic at all. You will find the work probably to be rather crude. And you'll probably have a hard time understanding how this guy can be one of the world's most famous 20th century painters. He had big shows at the Met in New York. He had a big show at the Art Institute in Chicago. He showed all over the world, of course, at the Louvre. Let's start to look at one of his paintings. His history as a young man, remember he was poor, so he had to start work at a very young age, and he became an apprentice in a stained glass studio. And so he had to help cut the glass, to shape the leading, and sometimes do the painting. Remember, stained glass is not always just glass. There's a special formula of paint they also use as a part of that art form. And so you'll notice throughout the images I'm going to show you, black outlining on almost everything. And that sort of reminds us of the stained glass type leading. But we also notice, in contrast to that black outlining, really vivid, deep colors. Now, the paint in a Rouault painting is at least 1/4 of an inch thick. Like Van Gogh, he applied the paint very thickly and kept building layer on layer and on layer until he felt right about that painting. And remember, it's more about expression than it is description. There's just enough description there to start to know what he's feeling about. And you can see by giving these vivid colors and these vivid contrasts to the Christ figure, you get a sense that this is something really important and special. As a part of his personal symbolism, he tried to deal with some of the harsher aspects of modern life. And so certain figures get caricatured in his paintings. I'm embarrassed to say one of them is college professors. Being ex-professor myself, it's a little hard for me to admit that. But there's a wonderful painting in the Art Institute of Chicago, a Rouault, called the Academician. And of course, I spent a lot of time looking at that painting, being a fellow professor myself. And it's a very judgmental painting. In this case, you'll notice Christ is being mocked by these two kind of crude-looking figures. Christ, his eyes are closed, and notice he's in this passive pose. He's got the robe on, although we don't see the crown of thorns in this image. You notice his hands are simply laying on his thighs. He's this quiet, passive, peaceful figure, and then off to either side, you get these crude caricatures of figures that are mocking him. The paint is tortured like Christ is being tortured. Can we see the next one, please? This particular work is probably one of Rouault's most famous paintings. It's actually, I don't think it's very large. You can see it's 21 by 30. Now, again, think of the title. It's called Old King. Kings, of course, represent authority and power. And the final authority of a king representing his power is his scepter. This king is holding a flower, not a scepter. He's clearly a king because he's wearing a crown. He's dressed in regal colors. And this is starting to suggest Rouault's sort of interpretation of Jesus preaching about the kingdom of God. I don't know if you're all familiar with the lessons in the 5th chapter of Matthew that are part of the Sermon on the Mount. But they're all contradictory visions. One of the most striking of them is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God. He gets that idea of weakness. If you read those parables, you realize they're a judgment against the way the real world works. And Rouault gets that. And he's trying to come up with a way of representing that concept of meekness inheriting the earth rather than power. Can we see the next one, please? Of course, he takes, in this particular image, a characteristic Christian symbol of the crucifix. And we have three figures around the crucifix. You notice how he doesn't care about normal understanding of space. He just jams them all into the particular image he's working with. To the right, I think you probably have those two figures. The blue figure is probably Mary, Jesus' mother. The taller red figure is probably the Apostle John. Part of one of the gospel stories, Jesus speaks from the cross and he says to John, "Behold your mother." So in other words, he wants John to take care of Mary. So they're usually grouped together. Now the figure on the left is a little more ambiguous, but my interpretation of it is that it's Mary Magdalene. I think it's, again, probably a female figure. And she, again, of course, represents the whole idea of forgiveness. She lived presumably this troubled life before she met Christ, and he transformed her life. Now, notice the subtle things Rouault does. At first, it looks like a really crude painting. But notice the coloration we get on the body of Christ. Yellows, peaches, hints of blue. Then look at what little we see of background in this painting. And notice those same colors get reinterpreted in the background, especially that red flash we see over the head of Mary Magdalene. And those become symbols of light and symbols of the resurrection. So it's not simply a tragic painting, it's also a painting of victory. There's a theological phrase that's often used in reference to the crucifixion called Christus Victor. I mean, in other words, on the cross, Christ became the victor over Satan. Not the victim, but the victor. Can we see the next one, please? In Rouault's personal theology, figures like clowns and prostitutes were always represented in a sympathetic way. They were sympathetic to him because they sort of served society, but they gave of themselves wholly to serve society. A clown, no matter how he feels, the show must go on. He has to get up there and act and make everyone laugh and be happy. But he has to work against himself in order to do that in a regular way. So he represents a kind of brokenness in modern consciousness, in modern life. And that's part of the tragic vision that's so much a part of Rouault's painting. Look at the measurements on this thing. Just a little bit, almost greeting card size. and it's in gouache, which is a kind of a water-based paint medium, rather like poster paint. Now, can we see the next one? There are almost 50 or so prints in a print series Rouault did, Le Miserere. And Miserere is part of the Mass, deals with the idea as the congregation pleads to the Christ, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy upon us. That's part of the Mass cycle. Those of you who come from a liturgical tradition, if you happen to be Lutheran or if you happen to be Episcopal, you know about those cycles. That's an important part of the Mass. Anyway, Miserere has to do with tragedy, the brokenness of life. We sin, we break our lives apart with our sinning. And in this case, we have a figure who's probably in the tomb. Miserere, this whole cycle, has soldiers who are being killed and so on. This figure might well be that of a soldier. You see something in the background there that's not completely clear. And I don't fully know what that represents. But the other really obvious image here is the head of Christ over this dead body. And notice it's represented with a kind of radiance. Even though it's a dark medium, it's just a black and white print medium. And by the way, this type of printing, you actually have a crayon-like material and you draw on a piece of limestone. And so you make a drawing on this stone, and then you wet the stone, roll ink on it. The ink only sticks where the drawing is. Then you put a piece of paper on top of that and put it through a press. And so you get an exact reproduction of the drawing. And anyway, by the nature of the medium, you can get beautiful, soft tones. It's a kind of unique, old-fashioned printing technique. Can we see the next one, please? This is a characteristic late Rouault. Notice the date on it. He lived into the 50s, if I remember correctly. But this represents a certain type of painting that becomes a culmination of his symbolism. By the way, we have two really wonderful Rouaults down at the Art Institute in Cincinnati. And one of them is one of these resurrection landscapes. This landscape becomes a metaphor for a more peaceful, bucolic kind of return to the Garden of Eden, a life. It's a kind of heavenly vision. I never quite understood what his symbolism is, but typically you know it's a resurrection landscape if you have a tower in the background. He included these towers, and in this case you see a road rather dramatically leading to that tower shape, and you'll notice a couple figures in the foreground. Much smaller figures now. We're distant from them. We're not right next to them the way we are in the typical other Rouault painting. And you get trees, and so it's bright color is sort of associated with gardens and so on. It's obviously not meant to be realistic painting, but the overall effect of it is a kind of serene, quiet, reflective beauty. And that sort of becomes the final metaphor for his presentation of his faith in the public arena. Now, I want to leave enough time here. Yes, I have done it right. We got about 10 minutes. This becomes, both of these painters in some way become controversial, and I want to be open to any questions you may have about them and their work. Yes?
Yeah, why do you think the church would have hired Caravaggio to do these? I mean, was it just his technical skill? Is there...
Remember, this is part of what we call the Counter-Reformation. The Protestant Reformation has just happened in the 1500s, throughout the 1500s. We're now in the 1600s. The Catholic Church reacts to the Protestant Reformation and has its own Reformation. It in many ways cleans up its act in reference to some of the monasteries, some of the political influences associated with the Catholic Church. And the church at this time is also, it's not just a spiritual force, it's a physical force. The papal states occupy a large part of the northern part of Italy, and these paintings are like political posters in the sense they function to enhance that political purpose of we're a Catholic country. We're not like those dumb Germans who are Lutheran. So this is, I think that's probably the main reason behind it. They didn't, if you know anything about the whole papacy and so on, and the entire history of the papacy, it's just an unhappy, dark history, and most Catholics are profoundly embarrassed by it. You could buy your way into the papacy. And so it's all external. Again, it's political. It's meant for outward show. And who's a better clown circus act than Caravaggio? Any other questions I can help you with? It's just about almost exactly noon right now. Anything? Thank you all again for coming. This is the end of this spring series. Maybe we'll have a series in the fall if my voice holds up and my brain holds up. We'll see. Thank you again for coming.